challenged.
Hey, you know what? All of you are wherever level you were at before the pandemic. All of you are basically like Bill Gates at this point, compared to
Right.
where we all were before. The topic for tonight, which is just a fascinating one, and there's no perfect easy answer to it, but we're going to explore some classic sources, including a very important modern Orthodox rabbi who passed away just a few years ago in 2015, who had some beautiful words to say about it. But the simple question is, can an observant Jew be unethical? Now, we'll step back for a moment before we jump into kind of defining what we mean here. Often we've seen in the news over the years, especially in certain neighborhoods, these seemingly deeply religious Jews, both in how they dress and presumably they're keeping Shabbat and Kashrut and all of the laws, but they're doing these seemingly unethical things. Now, there's a spectrum of that. If an Orthodox Jew maybe opens up a school without the right permit, that's not okay. That is breaking the law, but that's not the same as an Orthodox Jew who steals millions and billions from people or abuses someone or violates the sanctity, of any different relationship. And again, we have seemingly observant Jews across the spectrum. Now, one thing that's really important is if you have a Jew who outwardly appears frum, but secretly behind the scenes, they are killing or stealing or just doing these, deeply hurtful, destructive acts, I would simply say that this conversation is not relevant to them. Why? Because they're not observant. They're not pious. I'm not talking about people who are secretly pretending to be frum. I'm meaning someone who really is trying to live a life according to Jewish law. What I eat, how much charity I give, what I do on the holidays. Can a person who does the corpus of Jewish law still somehow be unethical? And again, we'll find that the answer is it's nuanced. It's not a clear black and white answer. So again, the question here is not about the people who identify as Orthodox, but truly they're monsters. It's not who we're talking about. We're talking about the average Jew who tries to live a religious life, and they focus on all of the laws and what you eat, when you eat, what you wear, etc., like that. Can that person still be unethical? And the first part of this conversation to look at is how we define both good and how we define observant. And I'm actually going to shift it a little bit. The word observant, meaning like it will usually mean to observe, to pay attention to something, in this context means somebody who is keeping Jewish law, the corpus of Jewish law, as best they can. Now, again, there's disagreement amongst Jews. How do we define Jewish law? But let's just say the standard generally accepted corpus of Orthodox Jewish law about Shabbat, eating, praying, business practices, all those kinds of things. That's observant. But a word that's often thrown around is frum. And the word frum, that's 10 classes in and of itself. You could watch the show Shtisel, and there's actually a great opportunity coming up here in Milwaukee, but that's a show where you can really explore what does it mean to be frum? Is it what you do, or is it how you dress? Is it the shows you watch? But I'm going to give a very, very simple definition of what it means to live a deeply religious Orthodox Jewish life, not getting into what you eat and Shabbat, but the core of being an observant Frum Jew. And Ken, if you would read this first verse from Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, who again gives some pretty severe but true advice on how to live a quality life. And near the end of his work, he basically summarizes at the end of the day, this is what Jews need to do. He's not going over the 613 mitzvot or the 16th century Shulchan Aruch of every Jewish law. He says, this is it. This is what it means to be a frum, observant Jew. Please.
The sum of the matter, when all is said and done, fear God and observe all his commandments, for this is the whole of man.
Great, and that's beautiful because it captures both the awe and the fear of God and our connection with God, so it brings God into it, but also says keep the commandments. And those are the two, at the end of the day, boils down to that. So the question, of course, that we're exploring is, if somebody's fully engaged in that system, fear God and keep the mitzvot, can they still then be considered unethical? Or is the system built so that if someone's actually keeping it, being unethical doesn't exist? And again, it's a really tricky question. But yeah, Ken, you have a thought or a question, please.
What did you say that I'm guessing supposedly within the law, within the commandments is one to be ethical. I mean, not that it has to be, something specific, one set of weights and measure. Don't put a stumbling block in front of, a blind person.
Yeah, don't take advantage of people who are ignorant of something or naive.
Right.
Yeah.
So it almost seems like a loaded question then. If you're really observant and if you're really trying to, and we all know we're not perfect, if you're really trying to do that, it's like yes or no. I mean,
no, it's a great point. There's
we'll
a part.
see.
Yeah, there's a part two of this class that I didn't include just because I felt it was getting, too deep into, it would have been like 3 or 4 or 5 more pages. But the idea is this: there's the set of Jewish law, and one can follow the law to the letter of the law. But the rabbis come along and they see certain laws that technically things are permitted, capital punishment, allowing certain loan things to happen, et cetera, like that. And they recognize that if the law is followed, again, literally to the letter of the law, it will allow for people to take advantage of others. It will allow for things that they consider to be unethical later in history. Now, the challenge is they don't want to go and say that God's law is unethical. So the rabbis say, if you hold by this, the letter of the law, you're good. We can't say you're breaking the law, but really, you should go lifnim misharat hadin, which means something like within the boundaries of the law, but it literally, or not literally, it figuratively means going above and beyond. Technically, you don't have to give this much charity. Technically, you don't have to, forgive the person in this situation. But really, it's good to go above and beyond. And the rabbis do that a lot. And one of the questions, again, that I think is a little beyond tonight is the system itself, let's say someone is following it perfectly, is the system of Jewish law perfectly ethical? And again, I think we explored that in a class we've given about capital punishment, where the rabbis are uncomfortable with capital punishment, but also recognize the validity and holiness of the law. So there is something to be said about, and I guess that could be an answer to this class, is an observant Jew who's keeping the law perfectly may not be ethical to the standards of the day. That's why I didn't make this class about that, because that's way too complicated. But the basic answer is that Jewish law, or at least practice, is flexible and adaptable to current ethical standards. But what we're just talking about is, let's assume that the basis of the law is generally ethical. We assume it's ethical. Let's say we even assume capital punishment, even if you agree it's wrong. Let's say that for our purposes tonight, it's ethical, and somebody's following all of that. Can someone still follow all the law and be an unethical person? We have a hand up, and then we'll go back to you, Ken. I'm going to just have to, go for it.
So I think just with every possibility available to us, and then a good point in hitting on the fact that what may have been considered ethical many years ago may not be considered ethical now. I think the question is more or less not that if somebody is ethical, but whether or not they do ethical things. So like they may be an ethical individual, but they may do unethical things.
I think that's a great point, and that's actually going to come up in the source number 2, which is just how we're defining, being good or ethical. So I think one of the things I'm realizing now is that, and I think this was intentional. Again, the question of, what is an ethical system? This is not a class to deconstruct all of Jewish law and talk about, is it an ethical system? Now, as Ken pointed out, much of the law is indeed meant to, like the Torah multiple times over and over says, protect those who can't protect themselves, the widow, the orphan, the poor, people who can't look out for themselves. So it's clear there's a strong ethical bent in Judaism. And as I said, the rabbis throughout generations have tried to adapt the law, or at least suggest that technically you could do this, but really, you don't have to get back the property, you don't have to pay this person, but you really should. It's the right thing to do. And if you don't, we can't censure, or we can't throw you in jail or give you any kind of real punishment, but we can censure you, and we can say that you're considered a wicked person. So I would actually say, as a general statement, no system of law is, let's say, the rabbinic system of law is not perfect, but I think overall it is quite ethical and it is adaptable. And I'm not going to make any comments on God's Torah, because I think the Torah gives us the building blocks that then we are meant to make an ethical system. So fundamentally, the system of Torah and the laws built on it, I think, is ethical. But the question is, can someone technically hold by all those laws and then live an unethical life? And Maria, I think you gave an interesting thing is somebody can be frum, but if they're stealing and killing, that's what I said. Is if they're stealing and killing, no, this class isn't about them. It's the people who are in between. So Ken, I'll have you take the second source here. And this is just literally from vocabulary.com, but it was a great, easy, accessible explanation of what do we mean by good. So please.
For someone who is honest and follows good moral standards, use the adjective ethical. An ethical teacher will grade your papers honestly, even if she catches you sticking your tongue out at her. Ethical comes from the Greek ethos, moral character, and describes a person or behavior as right in the moral sense, truthful, fair, and honest. Sometimes the word is used for people who follow the moral standards of their profession. An ethical lawyer or doctor does not try to take advantage of the client or the patient's unfortunate situation. If something has happened and you are not sure what the right thing to do is, you are having an ethical dilemma.
Excellent. So those words, truthful, fair, honest, really thinking about the good of other people and how you act. So on the one hand, we have somebody who is living a life where they're humble before God. They're trying to serve God by doing God's commandments. On the other hand, you have somebody who's really just trying to treat everybody with truthful fairness and honesty. And the question is there ever a time where you can be keeping the frum thing, being before God in mitzvot, but not keeping the truthful, fair, and honest? And we'll see how those differences can come out in the next source. So we have a hand up again, unless that was from before and I didn't put it down. Maria, is that you? Did I not put your hand down?
Yeah, I think I forgot to put mine.
Oh,
sorry.
Hands down. Nope, not at all. Okay, so Lindsay, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. So actually, I'm going to explain the source number one. So one way to understand this conversation in terms of somebody who's living a frum observant life is how do we categorize the actions that we are commanded to do by God? Again, if we're keeping God's commandments, which Kohelet says, what do those look like? And there's kind of four main categories. There's a mitzvot aseh. Those are things that we do. Give charity, shake a lulav on Sukkot, eat matzah on Pesach. Those are the active things that we should do. And if we haven't done those things, generally we've missed an opportunity, but there's generally there's no death penalty. Nobody's going to say we're unethical, usually because we didn't eat matzah, but we're supposed to. But if we don't, we missed an opportunity. The second category are mitzvot lo ta'aseh. Do not do this. Commandments of not doing. Do not kill. Do not steal. Do not, make a fire on Shabbat. When we do those, depending on the action, we're either unethical or if we've broken God's law, and there are punishments for that. So there's the active things that we're supposed to do in the world and the things that we're not. Now, you heard some of those examples. Okay, eating matzah, beautiful, and giving charity. But those sound kind of like different categories, and they are. And the rabbis break the mitzvot into two further categories. C is ben adam lemakom, literally between man and the place the place here is a euphemism for God. And these are ritual mitzvot, Shabbat, kashrut, all of those different ritual things, prayer, etc., like that. That's between man and God. And there's an interesting question: are those ethical mitzvot in any way, as opposed to section D, ben adam lechavero, between man and his friend, which is charity, stealing, killing. And those, whether it's active, i.e. do this, or don't do this, are generally seen as the ethical mitzvot. And that's kind of where we're gonna get into the weeds with this, is perhaps somebody can live a life where they're really close to God and trying to serve God, but they forget about their fellow human beings. So somebody davens, prays 10 times a day and keeps perfect kashrut Shabbat and everything like that. And maybe they even give the absolute minimum of charity, but they're clearly missing opportunities to help their fellow man. So I'm just going to move on now, but if we have questions, I'll take them in just a source or two, just for time's sake. But Lindsay, so I'm going to unmute you now for real. And this first source here is, there's kind of an apparent contradiction that will come out in this source. It's one of the most famous ones, talking about somebody who is righteous and wicked and good and bad. And we have all four of those words: righteous, wicked, good, and bad. And usually you would think righteous and good are the same and bad and wicked are the same. But we'll see a distinction here. So Lindsay, if you would please take source number 2 from the Talmud, Kiddushin 48. Rather, Rava said.
Rather, Rava said, Rav Idi explained the matter to me. The verse states, say you of the righteous who is good, that they shall eat the fruit of their actions, Isaiah 3:10. And this verse is difficult, as is there a righteous person who is good, and is there a righteous person who is not good?
So let's pause there for a moment. So just the verse itself uses the word righteous and the words tzaddik, righteous, and tov, good, and talking about people. And they're saying this is weird. Isn't that the same thing? Is it possible to be righteous and bad, or righteous and what's the difference? So please continue.
Rather, this verse should be understood as follows: one who is good, both toward heaven and toward people, is a good, righteous person. One who is good toward heaven, but bad toward people, is a righteous person who is not good.
So pause there again because sorry, I was just because it's so important to understand these lines. That's in some ways that's kind of the answer to our class. Is it possible to be a frum observant Jew and not a good person, unethical? And this is implying that yes, but they make a distinction. Somebody who is good at the mitzvot between them and God, ben adam lemakom, and between their fellow human beings, ben adam lechavero, they are both righteous and they are good. So those words righteous and good don't mean the same thing according to this explanation. This distinction is one is about ritual things, one is about human ethical based things. And even though God commanded us in both, as Ken pointed out, God wants us to do everything, it's possible to keep one and not the other. And that would lead to somebody who is deeply religious, going to the temple and keeping the, offering sacrifices and all this stuff, but they're a jerk. They're a jerk to others. They don't, when their animal is fallen and they say, please help me with that's the specific mitzvah I'm referring to. When your friend's animal is under a heavy burden, they say, I'm not going to help you lift that out. That's a mitzvah you're missing. You're not necessarily sinning per se, but you're clearly not choosing the right ethical help other people thing. And yeah, you're going to the temple to pray and offer sacrifices, but it's incomplete, except here, they say that person could still be considered righteous. There's still some good in that person. So please continue. Rava continues.
Rava continues on a similar note. It is written, woe to the evil wicked one, for the work of his hand shall be done to him. Isaiah 3:11.
And I'll just go on to the next page for the continuation of this source. And is there, and it's the same kind of thing. There's a verse there that talks about both wicked and evil. And are bad, or are they the same thing? And they say Rasha, like a wicked person, and Ra, which often is also translated as wicked, but they're technically two different words for bad, wicked and evil. So please, and is there a wicked?
And is there a wicked man who is evil? And is there one who is not evil? Rather, one who is evil toward heaven and evil toward people is an evil, wicked person. And one who is evil toward heaven and not evil toward people is a wicked person who is not evil. With regard to the issue at hand, only one who performs mitzvot that benefit others receives the profits of his mitzvot in this world. This does not apply to dispatching the mother bird, which is an act that does not benefit other people.
So that last line there's a mitzvah in the Torah that when one wants eggs, they send away the mother bird, and the Torah promises explicitly long life in this world. So that's an exception to the rule. But usually the only way to live a good life in this world is to be charitable, is to be kind to others and go out of our way, even if technically either we don't have to, or it's mitzvot that we are commanded to do to give charity, but we just don't do it. We're not actively hurting and killing people because that's just true evil. But to the question, again, that I asked at the beginning, can somebody be not religious and a good person? The language here is a little harsh, but they're kind of saying, yeah, this word Rasha, wicked, somebody who doesn't keep kashrut. And again, this is no judgment on anyone and any people's personal observance, but in the context of the Talmud in this conversation, the rabbis were not pleased with someone who didn't keep any mitzvot and ate unkosher food and broke Shabbat, et cetera, like that. Within their system and their world, of course, that makes sense, but they recognize that that person could go out there and be kind to others and be generous. And that person may be wicked, which is a ritual category, a religious category, but they may not be evil. So, and then there's somebody who just breaks every Jewish law, and they're just a monster to others and hurting other people. And that's just, those are, I won't say Haman because he wasn't Jewish, but the truly wicked, evil people. So we do see here that there is a distinction recognized in the Talmud of different categories of people. And the distinction they make is between are we talking about our relationship with God, ritual things, or relationship with the way that we treat other people? But it's important, again, to reiterate that these are all covered within the mitzvot. So hypothetically, at this point, somebody who's keeping all of Jewish law really wouldn't fall into one of these categories. We'll see kind of an exception to that in a moment. But before we go on, Maria, I see your hand is up again, and I know it's a new hand, so I think you have a comment or question. So you just have to unmute yourself. Yeah, go ahead, please.
I didn't actually raise my hand, so I have no idea.
How it got back up again? All right, well, it's great to hear your voice. I'm going to put it down, everyone. I'm putting it down now. So if I see it up again, that means you really do have a comment, which I'd love if you would. So the next source here is unbelievably famous in the conversation of somebody who is seemingly deeply religious, and Gloria and Leonard, I'm going to unmute you to get ready, deeply religious, but just evil. And the prophets talked about this at great length, particularly the prophet Yeshayahu. And if you haven't heard of this example, which other prophets use variations on it, this is the most famous example of people who are from, at least outwardly seeming to be from, and God's response is, I don't think so. So Gloria, please, from Yeshayahu, Isaiah 1:11 through 17.
Service without heart. What need have I of all your sacrifices, says the Lord. I am sated with burnt offerings of rams and suet of fatlings and blood of bulls, and I have no delight in lambs and he-goats. When you come to appear before me, who asked this of you to trample my courts? Cease bringing futile oblations. Your incense is offensive to me. New moon and Sabbaths, proclaiming of solemnities, assemblies with inequity, I cannot abide. Your new moons and fixed seasons fill me with loathing. They have become a burden to me. I cannot endure them. And when you lift up your hands, I will turn my eyes away from you. Though you pray at length, I will not listen, for your hands are stained with blood. Wash yourselves clean. Put your evil things away from my sight. Cease to do evil. Learn to do good. Devote yourselves to justice. Aid the wronged. Uphold the rights of the orphan. Defend the cause of the widow.
Thank you. Now, I used this word earlier about something else, but this is quite harsh and appropriately so. But there's a number of things to unpack here. One of the first ones is just a side point, is God says about the sacrifice, I don't really need your sacrifices. I don't eat food. So the reason you bring your sacrifice is for another reason, ultimately because I commanded you to. It's a famous debate between Rambam, Maimonides, and Ramban. But the point here is that in the times of Isaiah and many other prophets, the people were going to the temple, offering their sacrifices, offering prayers. They were doing Rosh Chodesh, the new month. They were doing all of the ritual religious stuff. But this is an important thing. They weren't going out in the streets and murdering and stealing. There might have been some, but really the failures of these people were not at being absolute beasts like in the time of Noah and the ark, where people were just evil. The issue here was that these people were not going above and beyond. They were not looking out for the oppressed. They're right at this point in history, financially, the Jewish people were doing really well. So the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer. And again, I think, unfortunately, we can really relate to that. But again, the people weren't actively going out there doing deeply evil acts. What they were doing is missing opportunities. And again, I'm oversimplifying a little, but kind of that's the main thing. God is saying to the Jewish people, it's not that you're absolutely, when he says blood on your hands, you're not murdering people in the streets. It's that I gave you a law that could make you better, that could make you more ethical than any other nation that you've dealt with. You are supposed to be the best there is. You are supposed to be a light to the other nation, an Or LaGoyim. You should make sure there is no poverty. You should make sure if anyone is injured or hungry, you feed them from your own table on Pesach. Open your door. That's what I expect of you. And you're failing on that stuff. And again, you're not killing people, you're not burning houses down, but that's not the point. I expect so much more of you, says God. And until you do that stuff, I don't need your sacrifices at all. So just don't, it's disgusting that you think you can get in my good graces by bringing me a lamb when someone outside hasn't eaten in 3 weeks. So it raises the conversation about good and evil to another level. This is people not living up to their potential. And this also gives a hint in the eyes of Yeshayahu, of the prophet Isaiah, about what God expects of the Jewish people. And God does not want a people who are just frum and cloistered and cut off from the world. God wants a people who are going out there being deeply, deeply ethical. So again, this is not the perfect example of people who are really keeping everything, because they're not giving charity left and right. They're not looking out for the orphan, but they are that basic definition of frum. They're serving God, they're bringing sacrifices and prayer, they're doing all the law, the ritual law, but they're missing all the opportunities on the between people law. And again, it's not that they're actively injuring other people for the most part, it's that they're not going out of their way to help people. So in this definition, and Gloria, I do see your hand, this definition here, it's another one where yes, people can be frum and unethical by not living up to the expectations that God really laid out. And again, if somebody really keeps all of Jewish law, they really would be doing this stuff. Even if it's not in their heart, they should be helping the poor. Everyone should be, if they keep everything, they will be giving charity. But that's what this suggests, is somebody can be totally rejected by God, even though they're totally frum, by not caring for others. Yeah, Gloria, please.
Yeah, so what about the people that unfortunately often in the newspaper seem to be observant? I mean, they wear kippah, or, you don't know what they're actually doing from day to day in their personal lives, but they appear to be observant Jews. Maybe they're even giving charity, or they give a lot of charity to different organizations. And yet on the side, they're swindling people right and left. I mean, are they then?
So this goes back to the, again, like talk about like the ideal Jewish person who has the perfect balance of both. And nobody is that, but these people are less that. And the reason is because again, there's levels of being unethical, and there's just somebody who's abrasive and they're just like not nice and they're just mean, but like they're not being unethical. They're unpleasant, and we should be pleasant. The rabbis imply in many places that, we should be pleasant and give, because when we look good, God looks good. And these people are doing the exact opposite. Their bad deeds are bringing a bad name to the Jewish people and a chilul Hashem. They're desecrating, lowering the name of God. But ultimately, the reason that it's not that they're a bad example for this class, so the perfect example to prove our point is they're not keeping all of Jewish law. And again, if we just said, we're defining frum and observant. By the way, I never said, but the word frum is Yiddish, perhaps German, might be the source of it very likely. It means pious. And translating pious is a whole other conversation. But when we say frum, it literally means pious. Colloquially, frum means someone who's observant and keeps Jewish law. So I'll repeat that again, because that's so important. If you know it, great. If you don't, frum literally means a pious, righteous, good person. Colloquially, it means someone who keeps Jewish law. So Gloria, you're talking about people who look to be frum, identify as frum, they're part of a frum community, but and they might even give a lot to charity, but they're going and they're breaking all kinds of tax laws and everything like this. And my response is, they're not keeping all of Jewish law, because Jewish law recognizes, unless the local law says that Jews can't keep kosher or can't do circumcision, that's the only time that we can fight against local law. But anything short of that, like copyright law, is we should all be keeping it. Tax law, we all need to pay our taxes. And if we're not, we're breaking Jewish law. And that is both breaking Jewish law, meaning the person is not fully frum, they're not fully observant, and it's certainly unethical. So I think that's the case that kind of proves the point, is somebody who's not keeping all of Jewish law is oftentimes also unethical. And this prophet, this source in Isaiah, are people who are generally not keeping all of Jewish law. They're not necessarily breaking the don'ts, but they're not doing all of the positive, constructive do, give charity, look out for the other, et cetera, like that. And that indeed, in the eyes of Yeshua, is unethical. And that's an important distinction. We would all agree, hopefully before this class, a murderous thief is both breaking Jewish law, so they're not observant or frum, and they're totally unethical. But the question is, somebody who just, they're not very charitable, they don't really care about other people, but they do the basics and they live kind of frum observant life, are they unethical? And this is kind of implying that, yeah, it's possible to keep all the laws and be unethical by not going above and beyond. The next source here, Again, I'll take questions in a second. The only reason, because this next source is basically unpacking and just building on the previous things. So Leonard, if you would please take, here, I'm going to make it a little bit bigger, just move it over. So this is from Rambam and his Mishnah Torah. And again, his Mishnah Torah is dozens of incredible books on every area of Jewish law, but his work on the laws of teshuvah, returning to God and breaking our negative actions, is one of his most well-known sections. And probably every year, everyone should really read it before Yom Kippur. It's accessible, beautifully written, and it's most famous. It's more famous than his section on, what kind of blood do you splatter on the altar, etc. So Leonard, please, how exalted is the level?
How exalted is the level of tshuva? Previously, the transgressor was separate from God, the Lord of Israel, as Isaiah 59:2 states. Your sins separate between you and your God. You would call out to God without being answered, as stated in Isaiah 1:15. Even if you pray many times, I will not hear. He would fulfill mitzvot only to have them crushed before him, as Isaiah 1:12 states. Who asked this from you, to trample in my courts? And Malachi 1:10 states, oh, were there among you, were there one among you who would shut the door that you might not kindle fire on my altar for no reason? I have no pleasure in you, says the God of hosts, nor will I accept an offering from your hand. Now he is clinging to the Shekhinah, as Deuteronomy 4:4 states, and you who cling to God, your Lord, he calls out to God and is answered immediately.
Thank you. So again, this is not somebody who's totally observant and God rejects them. This is somebody, he brings a lot from Isaiah and then also the prophet Malachi, is somebody who does have a lot of sins. Yet at the same time, so they may have gone out, and again, this goes back to your example, Gloria, this is the person who went out and they're in the mafia, but they don't kill on Shabbos. There's a famous Jewish mafia person who was famous for doing that. He was a hitman who wouldn't kill on Shabbos. So he murders 3 people during the week, and then he goes to shul and he's, praying from the head and leading services. Is this explicit? God throws his prayers back in his face. And again, that's not somebody who's fully from an observant. It's somebody who's behind the scene, really doing a lot of sins. But again, we keep saying this distinction that and in fact, it's a very important distinction, that somebody who thinks that all that really matters is keeping the ritual stuff and I can be as unethical as I want and God will accept me, absolutely not. It seems here and in many of the prophetic sources, perhaps even explicitly, that God actually cares more about the way we treat each other. Now, again, both as a rabbi and other sources I've seen, ideally a Jew would do both, the ritual and how we treat each other. But I think the prophets recognized that people were defaulting on, I can just bring an ox and a lamb and I'm good with God, and now I'm going to go rip off these people over here. And the prophets bring the word of God saying, absolutely not. And again, the second, the next class would be, we don't have the schedule, maybe we will. So what about somebody who treats everybody else with so much kindness and love and they do all the ethical stuff, but they don't do any of the ritual stuff? Is that person considered good? And we saw in the earlier Talmud, the rabbis see them as a kind of in-between. They're not good, like what is a good Jew? They're not good. They even use the word wicked for them, but they recognize that they're not evil. What does that mean? It'll take a lot longer to unpack it. But we can see that there's a lot of nuance here. But somebody who is ostensibly on the outside leading a frum life, but secretly doing all these things to besmirch the Jewish name and break tax law. I'm using that because that's extremely common. Or mistreat workers. That happened in a kosher slaughtering plant. That demeans and lowers everything else they do ritually. Even their charity. Their charity, it helps other people, but the merits, the blessings they get for it disappear because of all of the evil deeds that they bring with it. So Maria, I'm going to unmute you now, and I think this time your hand's really up. We will find out. Excellent.
It was.
Yes, go for it, please.
I think my phone was really, really eager to answer questions. I have no
no
idea.
worry.
But it almost, this is a really tricky situation because effectively Torah commands us to care about other people. And so when people don't care about other people, they're effectively violating Torah, not just necessarily being, slightly unethical or bending the rules. They're actually quite breaking them. It states to defend the widow and the orphan, and that's part of what we do. So it's hard to people on one hand, you don't want to label somebody as a wicked and evil person, because even though they are only appropriately behaving with ceremony, they're being not necessarily cruel, maybe, but at least indifferent.
Yeah.
God
That's a
forbids
great
us
word.
to
We'll
be
see that
indifferent.
again in a second. Indifference.
God forbids us to be indifferent. So
Yeah. Absolutely. God codified kindness and protecting those who can't protect themselves. And again, if we had a takeaway from this class, it's both that the ideal, the vision that God gave us is that the ritual stuff cannot exist and is not as valuable. God wants a connection with us when we are being good, righteous people and helping each other. God connected with us in order to inspire and command us and direct us to be good towards others, to be benevolent and loving towards others. And when we fail at that, God basically says, I don't want a relationship with you until you're living up to your potential. And I imagine most people are not like this. Most people are Benoni in the middle. I'm sure all of us are kind of in the middle, and that's fine. We always in the middle, leaning towards being better. But for the many people out there who get in the news, who this Orthodox Jew was caught, with whether it's pedophilia on one extreme or just tax evasion, which again is bad, but in a very different way. They are, first of all, again, they're giving the Jewish people a bad name, but they're not observant and they're not frum. And I think that kind of is the answer, is if somebody is truly engaged in the full corpus of Jewish law, both the 613 mitzvot of God, but also the rabbinic system, which develops and evolves and changes and is not as perfect as God's system, but does adapt to new understandings of right and wrong. If somebody is really living fully within that system and striving to live, no, I don't think that person will be a deeply unethical person. Can they miss opportunities and not be perfect? Sure. But somebody who's really striving to give charity, to go out there, the Rav Avi Weiss who found my yeshiva, he's somebody who lives a deeply observant religious life, and he goes out of his way to help other human beings. He's one of the best living examples of somebody who is both frum and ethical. So that's a good example of both. So I don't think that somebody who really lives in the system can be unethical. Can someone live in the system and not be perfectly ethical? Yeah, but it's also probably because it's hard to keep all of Jewish law perfectly. It's hard to go out there on the front lines during a pandemic and be helping feed people and care for people. That is physically, emotionally, and mentally hard. We don't all have the strength to go out and help every widow and orphan, but we have to try. So somebody who has the strength to do it all, they are the ideal human being. They are truly good and ethical. Most of us are in the middle. So I think that's a great point. So I'm going to go ahead and take this last source. So Rav Aharon Lichtenstein passed away in 2015, and that was a great loss for the whole Jewish world, particularly modern Orthodoxy. I read, actually, he was born in Paris, but he was an American rabbi for years, studied under the great Rav Soloveitchik, but he lived his last many years in Israel. He had a yeshiva there. And if you ever say, Rabbi Dinan, where's 99.9% of the Torah you get? It's from the yeshiva where Aharon Lichtenstein taught. And they have a website, Virtual Beit Midrash, but don't go there because you'll say, hey, Rabbi Dinan based a class on this. You'll know all my secrets. But Rav Aharon Lichtenstein was a doctor, got a doctorate at Harvard, and he was brilliant. And most of the time, it's impossible to understand what he was writing. So to his father-in-law, Rav Soloveitchik. I have no idea what they're talking about half the time, but they were brilliant, and they were truly ethical, good religious people. And he directly, in fact, a lot of this piece, a lot of these sources were influenced by a piece that Rav Lichtenstein Zatzal put together. So he talks about this exact topic. He says, I find it inconceivable from a Jewish perspective to refer to a person as a tzaddik, righteous, albeit a tzaddik ra, a person who is righteous and wicked, if he is mahader, excessive, meaning going above and beyond in the area of Ben Adam Lamakom. So again, this is somebody who's doing every area of ritual Jewish law meticulously. The person who for Pesach, they take their entire house apart, brick by brick, nail by nail, scrub them down and put them back together. No one does that, but somebody who goes to that extent. So talking about that level of excessiveness, that he has Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin. So there's a custom that there's two possible traditions for the tefillin and what texts and scrolls can go inside. Everybody agrees Rashi, but some people, just to be safe, will use Rabbeinu Tam, which is Rashi's grandson, and they'll put in a second pair of tefillin, just so they cover every possibility. They want to make sure they cover every opinion. Wow, going above and beyond. Kafel Shmona Tzitzit, he ritual objects conforming to stringent opinions using special tzitzit, etc. And eats only hand-baked matzah and glatt meat. So they're going crazy, everything ritual. Some of these things I do myself, so they're not so crazy. But within the area of Ben Adam Lechavero, he tramples everything underfoot. Is it really possible that a person who is a thief, murderer, liar, and cheat can be described as a tzaddik, but a tzaddik ra? All because he has fancy tefillin. So he asked the question that we didn't really ask, is going back to that Talmud, they say someone who keeps all the ritual stuff, but not the human interaction stuff, is still righteous, but a righteous wicked person. And he says, that doesn't sit square with me. And that's kind of what we've been talking about, is somebody who keeps the ritual stuff, but mistreats others. I don't think the ritual stuff has any meaning. And that's essentially what Isaiah said. So he continues, and he quotes the source. I think the Gemara in Kedushin is referring to something else, not a person who tramples underfoot the whole area of Ben Adam Lechavero. So not Gloria, the people who are outwardly dressed from, but they're secretly putting hits on people and robbing people blind. That's not what the Talmud, according to Rav Lichtenstein, was talking about. But a person who is simply oblivious to it. He pours his energies into and concentrates upon the area of Ben Adam Lamakom, again, the ritual stuff, between man and God, to such an extent that he has neither the energy, resources, nor motivation to work within the area of Ben Adam Lechavero, again, between people as well. It is in this sense that he is a Ra Lebriot, evil to mankind. He does nothing for them. He has no social conscience and is insensitive to the needs of others. He is totally concerned with the area of being tov lashamayim, good to heaven. And I think that's the kind of the answer that we're kind of building up to in this class, is the person who they're not evil. They're not evil. And nor are they out there actively doing unethical things. So I think the original question, can someone be frum and unethical? I don't think so. But can somebody be frum and not ethical, lacking the, Marie, you said it beautifully, they're not actively doing ethical actions. Can someone be that? And the answer is yes. And I think that's, again, what Isaiah was talking about. Not that the people were murdering each other in the streets, it's that they were rich and happy. So they're like, oh, we're rich and happy, so we'll give sacrifices to God, but I'm not going to share my wealth with anybody. They weren't actively trampling and destroying others, but they were just oblivious. And that's a sin that many people today, and I'm sure all of us at some point, if not regularly, are guilty of, which is we may focus on the easy things, but the challenging things that take a lot more energy, we just don't put our effort into. And that doesn't make us evil or unethical. It just means we're not living up to our potential. So Rav Lichtenstein continues, and then we'll kind of unpack it all. This person, which again is a pretty average, typical person. Most people are kind of on the spectrum around here. This person represents a partial and limited frumkeit, being pious, but a legitimate frumkeit. And that's the key here. Rav Lichtenstein, and according to that Talmud, says the person who does all the Shabbos and kashrut and davening and all that kind of stuff, they could be considered frum. It's not ideal, but it is frum. This is not to say that this is in any sense ideal, he says, nor is it recommended. After all, we need to strive not only to be tzaddikim, but tzaddikim tovim. So there is a value in doing the ritual stuff. But if the ritual stuff is with active murder, the ritual stuff means nothing. The person who kills and murders in the mafia and then goes to shul, their prayers are thrown back in their face. But that's not most people. It's the person who through the week, they're selfish. They don't hurt others, but they're selfish. They're oblivious. Again, a very typical thing to be. And then they go to shul and pray to God, and God, I love you for all the good I have. That's the person. They're not evil. And there's even a good aspect to them religiously, but they're incomplete. And again, that's kind of, an answer, that's kind of a takeaway. There's an incompleteness. But insofar as it goes, it is legitimate and real. Were a person, however, to be evil in an active sense, he wrongs others, injures them knowingly, willfully, viciously, then he surely could not be defined as a tzaddik, a righteous person in any sense. And of him, it is said that his mitzvot are thrown back in his face. He buys these fancy Rabbeinu Tam tefillin, and he has kafel shmona tzitzit, these fancy tzitzit that you wear, and they are thrown back in his or her face. So again, going back to the original question, can somebody be fully observant, for putting aside the word from, can someone be observant of all of Jewish law and be unethical? I think the answer is no. But can someone live a frum religious lifestyle, but also be lacking in their ethical imperative and their commands? Can they be lacking there? Yes. Do we say that that person is a wicked monster? No. Do we say that God would throw their prayers back in their face? No. But do we say that God expects a lot more of them and they are not really keeping Jewish law in its fullest sense, as some of you said? Yes, they're not keeping Jewish law in its fullest sense. So Jewish law, again, the rabbinic system and adapt and change, but the Torah gave us a perfect basis of it that the rabbis built on. If someone really keeps that, I think they will live an ethical life actively and in their hearts. But most people, it's hard to do that system perfectly. So most of us are kind of in the middle. And as Rambam says, as long as you're leaning towards trying to do better, give a little bit more charity, try and make a call to somebody who's struggling, particularly during the pandemic. You don't all have to be a truly perfect, righteous, good person, but you have to strive to be that. But somebody who does all of the outward stuff, Gloria, like you talked about, but they behind the scenes are ripping off the government left and right, then their righteous thing means absolutely nothing. They're not from in any sense of the word. And that's a key. Somebody who identifies as from, dresses from, acts from, but they're actively breaking unethical things, unethical actions, they're not from. That's a total lie, and God will throw their prayers back in their face. But most people